The ballroom smelled of polished oak and perfume, but beneath the sweetness hung something sour, the stink of pride and fear. Lanterns flickered across the high ceiling, casting moving shadows like hands crawling along the walls. The colonel stood near the front, chest thrust forward, silver buttons on his uniform catching the light. His jaw was clenched. Tonight was supposed to be his victory, not his humiliation. His daughter Eleanor stood beside him in a silk dress that shimmered faintly with every nervous breath she took. Her hands twisted the lace at her waist. Sweat gathered along her hairline despite the winter air outside. She was not beautiful by the standards of the South. The whispers had made that clear for years. But tonight she hoped someone, anyone, would look past the roundness of her face and the weight she carried. The colonel had invited 40 suitors from neighboring towns. Wealthy men, ambitious young heirs, men who craved influence. They came for the feast, the music, the promise of inheritance. But one by one, when their names were called to approach her, their smiles thinned, their eyes hardened, and their polite masks cracked. The first man bowed stiffly and muttered a polite refusal. The second smirked and laughed, loud enough for the others to hear. The third didn't bother to hide his disgust. Eleanor stood through every rejection. At first she tried to keep her chin high, just as her father had taught her. Then she tried not to cry. By the 12th suitor, her hands were trembling. By the 20th, her chest burned as though every laugh had carved another wound into her ribs. The colonel's fingers tightened around his glass of brandy. His face darkened to a shade somewhere between rage and shame. People were watching him now, not her, and that made it worse. His power had always been unquestioned. He was the man who commanded fear in others. But here, in his own home, in his own ballroom, they were mocking him, mocking his bloodline. The 33rd suitor, a tall, smug young man with gold buttons and perfect teeth, leaned toward a friend and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, "I'd rather marry a mule than that cow." The laughter that followed was sharp, like a blade dragged over glass. Eleanor heard every word. Her father did nothing. His pride wouldn't let him lash out. Not yet. But something shifted in him. He stopped drinking. His jaw went still. By the time the last suitor stepped forward, the ballroom was colder than winter outside. Eleanor's hands hung limply at her sides, her eyes glassy. The final man shook his head before her name even left the announcer's mouth. No one wanted her. Not a single soul. When the music stopped, it was as if the house itself held its breath. The guests tried to return to chatter, but the laughter was strained. No one wanted to be near the colonel now. They had all seen his failure, his embarrassment, his daughter's humiliation. Eleanor walked slowly toward the back of the room, away from the chandeliers, away from the pitying eyes. In the quiet corner near the draped curtains, she let her hands press against the wall, as if to keep herself from collapsing. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts. Her ears rang with their laughter. Her father's boots echoed behind her. "Eleanor." His voice was low and hard. She didn't turn. "You will stand tall. You will not cry." "I'm not crying," she whispered. He exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. 40 men. Not one with the courage to take my daughter. Not one with the sense to see the fortune they could have had. "You shame me tonight." Her throat tightened. "I didn't ask for them to come." The colonel stared at her profile, the roundness of her cheeks, the trembling shoulders. He had built everything on control. His slaves, his land, his family. But this public disgrace, he would not forgive. Down the hallway, servants whispered nervously, avoiding his gaze. The music never returned. Guests slipped out the front door one by one, their boots clattering on the steps as the night wind swept through the house. When the last carriage rolled away, the colonel returned to the empty ballroom. Tables of untouched food stood like silent witnesses. A ribbon from her dress lay on the floor. He picked it up, his jaw tightening further. To him, this wasn't just about her. It was about him, about what the world had dared to do to his pride. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in front of her mirror, hair still pinned in place, makeup smeared around her eyes. She stared at her reflection, but it was not herself she saw. It was the way they had looked at her, as if she were a spectacle. A punchline, a curse. The house was silent except for the wind rattling against the windows. A candle flickered near her bed. Shadows stretched long across the room, making everything feel heavier. In that silence, something inside her shifted. Not broken, no, not shattered, but hollowed out, emptied. Below, the colonel poured himself another drink. He whispered to the empty room, his voice dripping with venom. "They'll learn to respect my name again, one way or another." In that house on that cold night, neither father nor daughter slept. But it wasn't just shame keeping them awake. It was the beginning of something far darker. A decision that would change everything. The wind was howling that night. Thick clouds smothered the moon, swallowing every scrap of light. The plantation house stood like a shadow against the trees, its windows glowing faintly with oil lamps, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Inside the colonel's study, the fire burned too hot, licking the bricks like it wanted out. The colonel sat in his leather chair, the ribbon from Eleanor's dress still clenched in his fist. He had not forgotten the laughter. Not one smirk, not one word whispered behind gloved hands. It burned in him like a fever. 40 rejections, 40 insults. His blood boiled at the thought. In this world, men like him weren't meant to be humiliated. They were meant to be feared. Footsteps echoed in the hall. A butler stepped into the room, face pale. "Sir, Miss Eleanor isn't sleeping." The colonel didn't turn. "I don't expect her to. She's in the east wing, just sitting by the window." He waved the man away with a sharp flick of his wrist. He didn't want to hear about her tears. He wanted a solution, something final, something that would remind everyone in this county what it meant to mock his name. The storm outside thickened, rattling the shutters. Thunder rolled in the distance, slow and heavy. The colonel stood, poured himself another drink, and stared at the portrait on the wall. A younger version of himself, chest out, sword on his hip. A man who took what he wanted and feared no one. He missed that man. Then an idea came. A cold, twisted thing. He rang the brass bell on his desk. Within minutes, 2 overseers appeared, still in their boots, rain dripping from their coats. "Yes, Colonel?" "Get the field men. All of them. Line them outside the quarters, now." The younger overseer hesitated. "Sir, at this hour?" "There's a storm." The colonel's voice snapped like a whip. "Did I ask for your thoughts, boy?" The man lowered his head. "No, sir." "Then do as you're told." They hurried out. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in silence, wrapped in her nightgown, staring out the rain-streaked window. Her reflection floated faintly on the glass, a pale, round face framed by loosened hair. She heard the shouts outside, the sound of boots in the mud, the low grumble of men being gathered. Her chest tightened. Something was happening. Minutes later, the colonel banged on her door. He didn't wait for permission to enter. "Put something on," he ordered. She turned slowly, confused. "What? Why?" "We're going outside." "I don't want to." His voice cut through hers like a blade. "Eleanor, now." She obeyed, though her hands trembled as she fastened her cloak. The hallway was cold, the candles nearly out. The house itself seemed uneasy. Outside, lanterns burned in the wet wind, the flames bending sideways against the storm. Dozens of enslaved men stood in a line, heads lowered, their faces shadowed by the rain. Chains clinked softly. The overseers hovered nearby with rifles, though even they looked uneasy. Eleanor's breath hitched. "What is this?" The colonel stepped forward, boots sinking into the mud. He raised his voice so everyone could hear, as if making a grand announcement. 40 men came to my house," he said slowly. 40 men refused what they should have begged for. They spat on my family name, on my daughter's worth. But a woman like her will not go unwanted. No, she will be taken. A murmur rippled through the line of enslaved men, not loud but sharp, like wind cutting through leaves. The overseers tightened their grip on the rifles. Eleanor took a step back. "Father, stop." He turned to her, face hard as stone. "You've seen how they look at you, how they mock me. This ends tonight. You will have your place. If they won't marry you, the slaves will keep you." Rainwater ran down her face, but it wasn't the storm that chilled her. It was his eyes. There was no love in them, only rage, only power. The men in chains stared at her, not with desire, but with something else. Something colder. She was the daughter of the man who owned their bodies. She was the symbol of their suffering. One of the older men in the line stepped forward. His wrists were scarred, his eyes hollow. He didn't speak, but the way he looked at the colonel said everything. "You are feeding her to something you don't understand." The colonel ignored it. "Take her," he barked. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. "No, father, please, you will not shame me again." Two overseers grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the line. She didn't fight, not out of acceptance, but out of something deeper, numbness. The kind that settles in when a soul realizes no one will save it. The enslaved men parted like a dark river. At the center of the quarters, the old well loomed, black, silent, watching. No one had touched it in years. Even the cruelest overseers avoided that spot after nightfall. The colonel raised his chin, proud of his cruelty, believing this act would restore his dominance. He couldn't see the way the men avoided the well. He couldn't feel how the air around it grew heavier, colder, like breath caught in the throat of the earth itself. The rain suddenly softened. The thunder went silent. For a heartbeat, the plantation seemed to listen. Eleanor stood at the threshold of the quarters. The overseers shoved her forward. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes dark and unreadable. Behind her, the colonel turned back toward the house, satisfied. To him it was done. The humiliation was gone. He had forced a resolution, but as he stepped through the doorway, he didn't notice the slaves' faces. They weren't angry. They weren't broken. They were afraid not of him, but of what he had just awakened. The night settled over the plantation like a heavy shroud. The cicadas screamed in the distance, their restless song mingling with the low creak of the house's wooden beams. A pale moon hung over the fields, casting long, ghostly shadows across the land. Inside the grand house, every room was silent, except for one. The room at the far end of the hall. The room she was in. Elias stood outside the door for a long time before pushing it open. His hand hovered on the old brass handle, slick with sweat. He had told himself it was just another night, just another purchase, but this didn't feel like the others. Something about that woman, about the way the other bidders stepped back at the auction as if she carried some kind of curse, had crawled beneath his skin and refused to leave. The door creaked open. She was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, her wrists still raw from the iron shackles. A dim lantern burned on the bedside table, lighting her face just enough for him to see the bruises at the edge of her jaw. The way her eyes glinted, not with fear, but with a strange, "Quiet fire! Get up!" Elias said, his voice low, rougher than usual. She didn't move. She didn't tremble like the others had. She only lifted her head slowly, meeting his gaze with a stillness that unnerved him. It wasn't defiance. It was something older, something colder. "You understand me?" he asked. She blinked once. Then she spoke for the first time, her voice soft and oddly melodic. "I understand everything, mister." Elias stiffened. Her words rolled off her tongue perfectly without the heavy accent he expected. "What's your name?" he demanded. She tilted her head, almost amused. "You can call me what they all did." "But it won't matter," he frowned. "And what did they call you?" Her lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "They called me Mercy." Something about the way she said her name made the room feel colder. The lantern flame flickered, though there was no wind. Elias stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch locking echoed in the quiet. He moved closer, the wooden floor groaning beneath his boots. Mercy didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Her calmness was like a blade pressing against his throat, silent but sharp. "I own you now," he said. "You do what I say, no exceptions." For a moment Mercy didn't respond. Then she tilted her head slightly as though studying him. "Everyone who said that to me is dead now," she whispered. The words hit him like a cold wind. Elias tried to laugh it off. "Is that a threat?" "No," she replied. "It's a truth." Something strange fluttered in his chest. Unease, perhaps, or a feeling he couldn't name. He crouched down, trying to force her to meet him at eye level, but she was already staring directly into his. Her eyes were dark, but behind them, something pulsed. Something alive. Something old. He reached out and gripped her chin, tilting her face upward. Her skin was cool to the touch, unnaturally cool for such a warm night. He expected fear, He expected pleading, but Mercy simply smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. "You'll learn soon," she said softly. A distant gust of wind rattled the shutters. For the first time since he bought her, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sharp edge of fear. He let go of her and stood quickly. "You'll stay in this room," he said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "There's nowhere to go." "My men will make sure of that." She gave no reply. Elias left the room, locking the door behind him. But as he walked down the long hallway, he couldn't shake the sound of something behind him. Not footsteps, not movement, breathing, slow, measured, as if the house itself had come alive. Downstairs, he poured himself a drink. His hands trembled slightly, something he hadn't noticed in years. He tried to convince himself it was just nerves, that she was just another woman. Another body added to the list of those who'd passed through his gates. But the memory of her eyes kept clawing at him. She wasn't like the others. And in the darkness of that locked room, Mercy slowly stood up. Her fingers traced the iron cuffs at her wrists as if testing them, not for pain, but for memory. The lantern flame flared brighter for a heartbeat, though no one was there to touch it. She whispered something in a language long forgotten by the people who lived on that land now. A language older than the house, older than the plantation itself. Outside, the wind rose. The trees bent. A single window cracked, a sound that echoed like a scream in the night. And Elias, lying in his bed hours later, woke suddenly with the unsettling feeling that someone was standing in the dark corner of his room. He saw nothing, but he knew. She was there. The first night had only begun. The house had always creaked at night. It was an old structure, its bones built from the timber of the very land it ruled over. The wind would slither through its cracks, and the floors would groan beneath footsteps no one wanted to claim. But this night was different. The whispers began just before dawn. Elias sat up in bed, heart pounding against his ribs. It wasn't the usual hum of insects or the sigh of old wood. This sound was inside the walls. A faint rhythmic murmur, like breath pressed against plaster. He held his breath and listened. Whisper, whisper, whisper. The sound seemed to slide along the walls, moving from corner to corner, as though something unseen was crawling through the house, dragging its voice behind it. He swung his legs out of bed and reached for the lantern. The glass chimney rattled as he lit it, spilling a soft golden light across the room. His reflection trembled in the mirror opposite the bed, not because the lantern shook, but because the mirror did. A hairline crack stretched down its center, fresh, sharp, and glistening. Elias frowned. That hadn't been there last night. He threw on his robe and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder than it should have been for summer, cold enough that his breath left a faint mist in the dark. The walls, painted a faded cream, seemed to ripple with the sound, like a pulse beneath skin. Whisper, whisper. His boots creaked as he approached the end of the hall, the door where she was. Mercy. The guard he'd stationed outside the room was gone. Only his rifle leaned against the wall, and the chair he'd been sitting in lay tipped on its side. A dark streak stained the floorboards, stretching toward the stairs. "Damn fool probably ran off," Elias muttered, though his voice cracked in a way that betrayed him. He reached for the door. The metal key in his hand felt colder than iron should. When the lock turned, it didn't click. It screamed, a sharp, unnatural sound that made his stomach twist. The room was empty. The lantern still burned on the table. The bed was untouched, but Mercy wasn't there. What was there was something worse. On the wall above the bed, etched into the wood in long, deliberate strokes, were words, not in English. Not in anything Elias recognized. Symbols that twisted as he stared at them, as if the wall itself was breathing. The shadows stretched along the carvings like fingers reaching for him. A gust of cold wind blew through the room, though every window was shut. The lantern flame danced wildly, then snapped upright again as if caught in someone's breath. "Mercy," Elias barked, his voice echoing against the walls. No answer, but the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the hall anymore. It was inside the walls of this room, pressing against the wood, sliding behind him, then ahead of him. He spun around. Nothing, and then faintly, behind the bed, a voice. "She doesn't belong to you." Elias froze. The whisper was low, neither fully male nor female. It slid through the air like smoke. He yanked the bed aside. The wall behind it looked the same at first, old wood, cracked with age. But when the lantern light hit it just right, he saw the outline of a door. Not a real door. A hidden one. Elias pressed his hand to it. The wood was warm. A heartbeat pulsed through it, faint but undeniable. He jerked his hand away as if burned, and then something knocked back from the other side. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Elias staggered away, nearly tripping over the bed frame. The lantern light wavered, and for a moment he swore he saw something press against the wood from the other side. A shape, a face, a shadow with no features. He slammed the door shut and bolted out of the room. But the house didn't let him go easily. As he rushed down the hallway, the whispers followed, growing louder with each step. He could hear words forming now, fragments of sentences in that same foreign tongue Mercy had whispered the night before. The paintings on the walls tilted as he passed, one after another, like they were bowing to something that moved behind him. He burst into the main hall. The chandelier swayed, though no wind touched it. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to grin wider, their eyes following him with a cruel, hungry patience. Elias. He spun around. Mercy stood at the top of the staircase, barefoot, calm. Her white dress clung to her like mist, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. But it was her eyes, those deep, ancient eyes that rooted him to the floor. "How did you get out?" he demanded. Her lips curved into that same unsettling half-smile. "I was never locked in." Behind her, the walls seemed to pulse like lungs filling with air. Whispers rose, overlapping, layered upon each other like a choir of the dead. Elias stumbled back, clutching the railing as the air thickened with cold. "What are you?" he hissed. Her expression didn't change. "Something you should have left alone." The house shuddered. A sound like splintering bone echoed from the upper floors. Elias looked around wildly. The whispering was no longer coming from one place. It was everywhere, vibrating through the beams and floorboards. Mercy began to descend the stairs slowly, one step at a time, her bare feet leaving faint, wet prints on the wood though she wasn't wet. With each step, the whispers grew clearer. Now they were names. Names Elias didn't recognize, but that seemed to echo with sorrow and rage. The walls almost seemed to breathe with her. Elias grabbed the rifle, leaning against the wall. His hands trembled, but he raised it. "Stay back." Mercy tilted her head, almost pitying. "You can't shoot what's already claimed." The chandelier crashed to the floor between them, shattering the silence into 1,000 glittering shards. Elias stumbled backward, falling hard onto the wooden floor. The whispers roared now, no longer whispers but screams buried beneath the skin of the house. Mercy stood in the shadows above him, her face half lit by the flickering lanterns. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and whatever lived within its walls belonged to her. Elias crawled back, his breath shallow, the whispers closing in like invisible hands. The house, once his kingdom, now felt like a trap, one built long before he was born. And Mercy, the woman no one had dared to bid on, was the key that had awakened it. The house had gone silent. Too silent. Not even the wind dared to move through the fields outside. The trees, those towering skeletal guardians, stood stiff, their branches unmoving as if the air itself was holding its breath. Inside, the whispers retreated into the walls like some living thing sinking into its veins. Elias paced the grand hall, his boots echoing against the warped wooden floor. The rifle lay abandoned where the chandelier had fallen. Glass crunched beneath his steps, but even that sound felt muffled, distant, like he was walking inside someone else's dream. He looked up the staircase. Mercy was gone, but the footprints remained, wet, dark, uneven. They led upward, not toward her bedroom, but toward the west wing. No one went there anymore, not since his father's time. The doors had been shut, the hall sealed off with thick planks years ago. That part of the house was rotting, forgotten. Elias followed the trail. He told himself it was because he wanted answers. But the truth was uglier. He couldn't allow his own house to turn against him. He couldn't allow her to. As he climbed, the air grew colder. The walls around him seemed to sigh. At the top, a wide hallway stretched out into shadow. Boards nailed across the double doors of the west wing bent inward, as if something had been pushing from the other side for years. He hesitated, lantern in hand, the flame flickering nervously. "This is my house," he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. "My house." The wood creaked in reply. He pried the boards loose one by one. Nails screamed out of the wall like they didn't want to leave. When the final plank fell, a rush of air blew out of the west wing, damp, cold and sweet in a way that made his stomach twist, like flowers left too long in a coffin. Elias pushed the doors open. The hallway beyond was black. Not dark black, the kind of black that swallows light whole. The lantern's glow reached only a few feet ahead before it drowned, and yet her footprints were there, shining wetly on the wooden floor. He followed them deeper. The air pressed against him like thick cloth, heavy and slow. Every step sounded distant, as though he were walking underwater. Whispers brushed against his ears again, not from the walls this time. From below, he reached the end of the corridor. There was a wall, but in the center of it, a faint outline of a door. Elias set the lantern on the floor and ran his hands across the wood. It was warm, that same heartbeat, that same unnatural pulsing rhythm. He pressed his ear to it. Drip, 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 water or blood. He couldn't tell anymore. The whisper came again, closer now. "Open it." His fingers trembled as he found a small iron hook wedged between the planks. He pulled it. Slowly, almost lovingly, the wall split down the center, opening into a hidden room. It was small, barely wide enough for two people to stand. But every inch of it was covered in carvings. The same twisting language he had seen above Mercy's bed sprawled across the walls like a sickness. Symbols carved by hand, some still wet. Bones hung from the rafters, strung together like wind chimes. Not animal bones. Human. And in the center of the room sat Mercy. She was barefoot, her white dress streaked with mud and something darker. Her hair fell forward, hiding her face, but Elias didn't need to see it. The room bent around her. The carvings pulsed in rhythm with her shallow breaths. She wasn't chanting. She wasn't speaking. The house was speaking through her. "Mercy," Elias whispered. His voice sounded weak, like a child's. She didn't move, but something else did. Behind her, where the wall should have been solid, a shape stirred. A mass of shadow, taller than any man, thicker than smoke. It pressed forward, making the carvings bulge and crack like skin splitting open. Elias took a step back. His lantern flickered. "Get out of here," he rasped. "Whatever this is, it ends now." Mercy lifted her head. Her face was pale as porcelain. Her eyes black. Not like pupils widened in the dark, but black all the way through, as if something had scooped out her soul and filled it with the night. "It's already begun," she said softly. "You gave me away, Father. You gave me to the wrong hands." Elias froze. "Father." She hadn't called him that in years, not since the night she had stopped smiling. "You're sick," he hissed. This witchcraft." Her mouth twitched into something between a grin and a grimace. "Witchcraft? No, this house is older than us. Older than your name. You built your fortune on its grave." The shadow behind her shifted. Elias could feel it now, a pressure in his skull, like fingers digging inside his mind. "It smelled like damp earth and old blood. Do you hear them?" she whispered. "They've been here all along, buried in your walls, waiting." Elias stumbled backward, but the door behind him slammed shut on its own. Nails shot through the frame like iron teeth. He was trapped. Mercy rose slowly to her feet. The carvings on the walls flared as if catching fire without flame. Whispers became screams, layered voices of men, women, and children crying out through her. The lantern shattered, darkness fell, and in that darkness, he heard the sound of dozens of hands dragging across the floor, across the walls, crawling closer. Elias slammed his shoulder into the door, but it didn't budge. He screamed for help, knowing no one would come. The house had chosen its prey. Mercy's voice floated through the black. "Every wall remembers what you built here." The shadow surged forward, wrapping the room in a cold so brutal it burned. Elias felt his knees buckle, his breath ripped from his lungs. He tried not to look, but it was everywhere. The faces of the dead, the bones he had buried, the blood his hands had washed away. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Mercy, standing in the center of it all, calm, silent, vessel, and the house whispering around her like a lover, returned from the grave. The house exhaled before dawn. A long, low groan slid through its bones like something buried too long beneath the floorboards had finally shifted. Every nail, every brick, every inch of wood remembered the night before. But none of it spoke in words, only in that deep, crawling silence that comes after something ancient wakes. The servants refused to enter the west wing. They whispered about the hidden room now, though none of them had seen it. The sound had traveled on its own. A maid claimed she saw muddy footprints in the hallway that started at the locked door and led downward. Another swore she heard someone singing inside the walls at midnight, but the most chilling whispers came from the fields. The slaves spoke quietly around the fires, their faces pale with fear, their eyes darting toward the house. "The well," they muttered. She went to the well. It was the same well their grandparents had told them never to go near. The same well where the colonel, Elias's father, had disposed of the bodies. Elias hadn't slept. He sat alone in his study, hands trembling as he poured another glass of brandy. He'd locked every door, every window, but it didn't matter. The house didn't care about locks. It breathed in his ear when he tried to sleep. It whispered his name in the dark. The events in that hidden room had carved something into him. Not with a knife, but with a truth he could no longer unseen. Mercy wasn't just broken. She wasn't just possessed. She was chosen. The lantern on his desk flickered. Not from the wind, because there was no wind. The air in the room was too still, too thick. Elias slowly raised his head. Across the study, the portrait of his father trembled on the wall. One nail popped loose. The canvas tilted, hung crooked, then slammed to the floor with a thud that echoed through the entire house. The painting's glass cracked straight through the colonel's smiling face. A voice, low and ragged, whispered behind him. "She's awake." Elias spun, rifle in hand, but there was no one. Just the door, slightly open now, though he was sure he'd locked it. He stepped into the hallway. It smelled of wet earth and something sweet. The same scent that came from the west wing, but stronger now, pungent, rotting. A thin, wet trail stained the floorboards. He followed it. Each step dragged like the air itself resisted him. It led to the staircase. Down, down into the basement. Elias had not been down there in years. It wasn't a basement so much as an old root cellar, a pit beneath the house where the slaves had once been chained and punished. His father used to call it the quiet room. Elias had never questioned what that meant. Now he understood. The door creaked open before he even touched it. The air that poured out was damp and cold, smelling of iron and grave dirt. He descended slowly, rifle raised, lantern shaking in his hand. At the bottom, the earth shifted beneath his boots. The stones were wet. In the far corner where the wall met the soil, something had pushed upward. Roots, bones, both. He couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, and there, standing barefoot in the mud, was Mercy. Her hair hung in thick strands over her face. Her nightgown, once white, was soaked in black water. She was facing the wall, whispering. Her breath made the shadows twitch like living things. Around her feet, the mud pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't hers. "Mercy," Elias hissed. "Turn around." She didn't. "Mercy," he barked louder. She moved slowly, like something had to remind her what a human body was supposed to do. When she turned, Elias felt the air leave his chest. Her eyes were still black, but now her skin was pale like wet ash. A faint red line traced down her throat like a necklace cut into her flesh. They called it a well, she whispered. But it wasn't a well. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. "What did you do?" She tilted her head, the way she always did when the house spoke through her. "What you buried," she said. "What he buried. It wants to come back." The ground rumbled beneath them. Just a little at first, like the earth stretching, then more violently, knocking the lantern from his hand. The flame went out with a hiss. Darkness flooded in. Elias stumbled backward, striking the wall. He could hear it now, not just whispers, but voices, dozens, hundreds, men and women, some crying, some laughing, all speaking from inside the earth. "You thought a grave could keep them," Mercy murmured. He raised the rifle, pointing it at her chest. His hand shook so hard the barrel wavered. "Whatever this is, whatever you've become, it ends now." She smiled. Not the smile of a woman, the smile of something that had never been human. "It's already begun," she said. "The land remembers what was done to it, and it's coming for you." The soil behind her split open with a sound like wet fabric tearing. Black water burst upward, spilling across the floor. Elias saw shapes moving beneath it, bones twisting, fingers clawing at the air. The voices grew louder. His breath came fast, uneven. He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot roared through the cellar, but Mercy didn't fall. The bullet never reached her. It hung in the air for a heartbeat and then dropped into the mud with a soft plop. "Wrong house," she whispered. "Wrong blood." The lantern reignited on its own, its flame now burning black. In that dim light, Elias saw every wall of the cellar moving, the mud swelling like lungs inhaling. The faces of the dead pressed through the soil, mouths opening in silent screams. The Colonel's sins had never left. They had only been sleeping. Mercy lifted her arm slightly as if inviting the voices closer. "They're not angry at me," she said. "They're waiting for you." The house groaned above. Floorboards split. A gust of freezing air rushed through the cellar, carrying with it the scent of centuries of buried blood. Elias stumbled toward the stairs, but they were gone. Swallowed by the earth, he was alone with her now, or rather, with them. And as Mercy's head tilted back, and she began to whisper in that ancient tongue again, Elias finally understood. This wasn't possession. This was judgment. The storm outside was louder than it had ever been. Thunder cracked like the heavens themselves were being torn apart, and each flash of lightning carved the grand hallway of the mansion in jagged white light. The portraits of long-dead ancestors seemed to watch from the walls, their painted eyes gleaming for a fraction of a second before the darkness swallowed everything again. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the brass candlestick. The flame trembled as if it too feared what was coming. His boots pressed against the polished floorboards with slow, deliberate steps as he moved toward the drawing room, the heart of the mansion, the room where everything had begun, and she was waiting. Elara stood in the center of the room, her back to the fireplace, the dying embers behind her casting an eerie red glow that outlined her silhouette. Her once torn dress had been stitched with crimson thread, the fabric clinging to her as though it had been waiting centuries for this moment. She didn't look like the trembling girl he'd bought at the auction anymore. She looked like something older, something that didn't belong to this world. "Why?" Nathaniel's voice broke the silence, though it carried no confidence. "Why are you doing this?" Her head tilted slowly, almost unnaturally, as if considering how best to answer. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 100 years, soft, but vibrating with something deep and relentless. "Because this house was built on blood," she whispered. "And blood remembers." He took a step closer, his heartbeat hammering against his chest. "You're not making sense. If this is about what happened..." She cut him off, her eyes flicking to the ceiling, to the walls, to the house itself. "This place doesn't forget. They thought they buried it. They thought their money would silence the screams. But it lives in the mortar, in the wood, in every breath you take inside these walls." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. For a moment he almost laughed, almost brushed it all away as madness. But the temperature in the room had dropped to a winter chill, and his breath now fogged the air. He wasn't imagining it. A deep groan echoed from the floorboards. The house shifted. Behind Elara, shadows began to crawl along the walls, warping and twisting as if they had a mind of their own. Figures emerged within them, the outlines of men, women and children, their faces blurred but their pain unmistakable. The very air pulsed with their agony. Nathaniel stumbled back. "Stop this!" Elara didn't move. Her hair flowed slightly as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Her eyes burned, not with fire but with a cold, ancient fury. "You brought me here," she said. "But this was never about me. I'm just the last voice of what you tried to erase." Lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat, Nathaniel saw them clearly, dozens of figures lining the walls, shackled, broken, watching him. He wanted to run. His body screamed to flee, but his legs refused to obey. "Ilara," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't build this place. I didn't. You carry their name." Her voice sliced through the storm like a blade. "You walk their halls. Their crimes are in your blood." The shadows lunged. A deafening crack ripped through the house as the massive front doors slammed shut. The windows sealed themselves as if the mansion itself had awakened. Nathaniel raised the candlestick like a weapon, but the flame died instantly, swallowed by the darkness. And then, silence. A silence too heavy to breathe in. The floor beneath Nathaniel trembled, and from the corners of the room, a low chant began to rise, not from Ilara's lips, but from the walls themselves. The language was old, guttural, soaked in rage. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. He fell to his knees. Ilara stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound. "This house was built on chains," she said. "Now it will bind you to the same fate." A shape emerged from the shadow behind her. Tall, cloaked, with hollow, cavernous eyes. The figure rested a skeletal hand on her shoulder, and she did not flinch. Nathaniel realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't protecting her. It served her. "Ilara, please," he gasped. "I can make it right." She stopped, inches away from him, her breath cold against his face. "No," she whispered. "You can't make right what was never yours to forgive." The chant grew louder, rattling the glass panes. Nathaniel felt hands, unseen but ice-cold, grip his arms and drag him backward toward the wall. The wood softened beneath his back, as though it were swallowing him whole. He screamed, thrashing, but the shadows only tightened their grip. Ilara watched, her face unreadable, her eyes reflecting the storm outside. As he disappeared halfway into the wall, the last thing he saw was Ilara raising her hand. The chanting stopped, and then, in a voice that was both hers and something much older, she declared, "The bloodline ends tonight." The walls snapped shut around him. Outside, the rain continued to pour, beating against the old house like a warning no one would hear. The whispering walls fell silent once more. But inside, the echoes of Nathaniel's screams were absorbed into the wood, joining the chorus that had been waiting for generations. The storm had not stopped by morning. Grey clouds hung low, pressing against the earth like a suffocating weight. The mansion stood still and proud, but something about it had changed. The ivy that crawled across the walls twitched with the wind as though it were breathing. The windows, streaked with rain, reflected nothing but blackness. The servants whispered among themselves, afraid to speak too loud. Nathaniel's absence was noticed but not questioned, at least not out loud. No one had seen him since the night before. No one had the courage to ask why the drawing room door was now warped, why the walls seemed to hum with a low, constant murmur. Inside the house, the air felt heavier. Each corridor stretched a little too long. Each corner seemed to hold something waiting just beyond sight. The chandeliers swayed ever so slightly, even though the air was still. Ilara walked barefoot through the hallway. Her steps were calm, deliberate. The night had stripped away the last traces of fear from her. The bruises on her wrists were still there, faint and fading, but her presence was no longer that of a girl bound. She moved like someone the house itself recognized. She reached the grand staircase and paused. The portraits on the wall were different. She hadn't imagined it. She couldn't have. The faces were subtly shifting. The once stern gaze of Nathaniel's father now followed her down the stairs. The matriarch's smile, once painted soft, was now cracked into a grimace. The brushstrokes moved like living flesh. Below, a cluster of servants froze when they saw her. Some bowed their heads. Others turned away, muttering prayers under their breath. Something in their bones knew the balance had shifted. She was no longer a captive. She was something far more dangerous. In the west wing, a sound echoed, a dragging noise, slow and uneven, like something being pulled across the floor. It started faint, then grew louder, closer. One of the servants, an older woman with trembling hands, dropped the silver tray she was carrying. It hit the ground with a sharp clang. No one dared to pick it up. Ilara turned toward the sound. The hallway leading to the cellar door was darker than usual, the candles flickering like they were fighting to stay alive. She walked toward it slowly, almost drawn by the invisible pull that had guided her since she arrived. The air here smelled different, wet earth, rusted iron, and something sour beneath it all. She reached the cellar door. It was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking like old bones. She pushed it open. The staircase spiraled down into darkness. A single lantern hung at the bottom, its flame weak and shivering. She descended without hesitation. The walls were damp, the stone cold against her fingertips. And then she saw it, a trail of something smeared across the floor. Brown, dried but unmistakable. Blood. At the far end of the cellar, behind rusted iron bars, the room she had seen in dreams lay open. The chains on the wall clinked softly, even though no one touched them. Nathaniel's voice whispered from somewhere deep in the shadows. Not loud, not clear, just fragments. "Can't breathe. Help, they're here." Ilara stepped inside. Her breath fogged in front of her. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her. Dozens of voices layered over one another, as if the house itself was trying to speak. And then she saw it. Nathaniel was in the wall. His body was half consumed by the rotten wood, his face pale and waxen. His eyes moved, darting back and forth like a trapped animal. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The house had taken him, but not completely. It was keeping him. She knelt beside the wall, her fingers hovering near his face. He flinched. "Ilara," he rasped, barely audible. "Help me!" Her expression didn't soften. Not anymore. She tilted her head, studying him like a relic, like a chapter in a book she had already read. "You belong to it now," she whispered, just like they did. His eyes widened, terror clawing through whatever was left of him. "Please," he croaked, "I can stop this. I'll fix it." She leaned closer, her voice low, almost tender. "You can't fix what was built on broken bones." The shadows behind him writhed like living things. Hands reached from the wall, pulling him further in, inch by inch. His screams tore through the cellar, but upstairs no one came. No one ever did. The storm roared above them. Ilara stood and backed away slowly as the house devoured what remained of Nathaniel. When it was done, the wall sealed itself with a sickening groan. The whispers quieted, but they didn't disappear. They lingered, wrapping around her like a shroud. As she climbed the staircase back to the first floor, something new moved in the air. The house listened to her now. The doors didn't creak when she passed. The chandeliers steadied. The walls, which had once whispered warnings, now whispered to her directly. "Ours now," they hissed. "Finish it." When she reached the foyer, the oldest servant, a frail man who had been on the plantation longer than anyone alive, stepped forward. His eyes were wide, but his voice was steady. "What are you?" he asked. Ilara turned to him. The firelight flickered across her face, casting half of it in shadow. "I'm what they tried to bury," she said simply. "And now it's time the world remembers." The grandfather clock in the corner struck noon. But instead of chimes, it emitted a long, hollow moan that echoed through the house like a dying breath. Paintings cracked down the middle. The floorboards buckled. The house was changing, shedding its disguise of wealth and grandeur. Beneath it was something much older and much crueler. The servants screamed. Some ran, some dropped to their knees and prayed. Ilara didn't move. She watched as the mansion, her prison, her torment, her inheritance, began to unravel itself. The storm outside began to calm. But inside, the chaos only grew. By nightfall, the house would not be a home. It would be a tomb, and Ilara would be its queen. The night fell like a curtain of ash. The storm that had raged for days was gone now, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural. The trees surrounding the plantation leaned inward, their bare branches creaking like they were listening. Not a single insect stirred. Not a single bird dared to sing. The air itself held its breath. The mansion was no longer a house. Its walls pulsed with a low, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of something alive beneath the floorboards. Cracks veined across the ceilings, bleeding a dark sap that dripped into the hallways. The air reeked of rust, damp earth, and something older, a smell like forgotten graves. Elara stood at the top of the staircase in a black nightdress, her hair tangled and damp with rain. Below her, the last few servants huddled near the front door, clutching rosaries, Bibles, scraps of fabric, anything they thought could protect them. Their prayers were trembling things, spoken through clenched teeth. She descended the staircase slowly. Each step echoed like a drumbeat through the house. The chandelier above flickered, then dimmed completely. Only the moonlight through the broken windows illuminated her figure. Her eyes were empty, but her presence filled the room with a pressure that made breathing hard. "Where is he?" she asked quietly. No one answered. The oldest servant, the one who had asked her what she was, lowered his eyes to the floor. The others followed as though refusing to speak might save them. But she didn't need their voices. She could hear him. Nathaniel, he was in the courtyard. He'd crawled there after the house spat him out. Or rather, after it decided to let him live long enough to witness. He knelt by the old oak tree, where the soil was soaked with generations of blood. His once polished clothes were torn, soaked with mud and rain. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from knowing what was coming. Elara stepped outside. The courtyard stretched out like a blackened wound under the silver moon. The oak loomed over Nathaniel like a hanging judge. The wind was still. Even the insects that usually hummed in the night had fled. He looked up when she approached. His face was pale, lips split and dry, eyes sunken into bruised sockets. He was no longer the colonel's golden boy, the heir of cruelty. He was a man stripped bare, facing the thing he had created. "Elara," he rasped. His voice cracked on her name. "Please, you don't have to do this." She tilted her head slightly as if curious at the sound of his begging. "No," she said softly. "I don't have to. But the land does." Behind her, the house groaned. The front doors slammed open of their own accord. A wind howled through the hallways like a chorus of the dead. One by one, the lanterns lining the path flickered to life, casting an amber glow over the field where the well sat like a yawning mouth in the earth. Nathaniel's breath quickened. No, not there." "Yes," she whispered. As they walked, or rather as he stumbled and she glided, the ground seemed to shift beneath them. The old sugarcane fields swayed, though no breeze touched them. Whispers rose from the soil, not in English, not in any language living men spoke. It was the language of the buried, the enslaved, the forgotten. They reached the well. It looked different now, wider, darker. The stones around it sweated moisture. The air that poured out from its depths was icy, as if it led somewhere far below the earth. And around the rim of the well, shapes began to emerge, shadowed figures, black and formless, rising like smoke. The dead had come to watch. Nathaniel fell to his knees. I never, his voice broke. It was my father. It was all him. Elara circled him slowly. Her bare feet left no mark in the wet soil. Her voice was calm, distant. "You think that matters to the dead? You carried his name. You carried his cruelty. You benefited from the bones beneath this house." The whispers grew louder. The shadows began to close in. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. "Please, I can fix it," he pleaded. "I can make it right." Her face twisted, not into anger, but something worse. Pity, cold and hollow. "No one can fix a graveyard, Nathaniel. The only thing you can do is join it." She raised her hand. Not high, not dramatically, just enough. The wind snapped around them like a whip. The ground shuddered. Nathaniel screamed as invisible hands, dozens of them, cold and ancient, wrapped around his wrists, ankles, throat. The shadows dragged him toward the well, his fingers clawing at the wet earth, leaving furrows behind. His pleas turned to shrieks, his shrieks to choking gasps. He looked up at her one last time. There was no pride in his eyes anymore, no arrogance, just raw, desperate fear. "Elara," he choked. "Don't let them..." She stepped closer, leaned down and whispered against his ear. "I'm not letting them. I am them." With that, the hands yanked him down. The well swallowed him whole. The soil closed like lips over a secret. The whispers fell silent. For a long time there was nothing but the sound of dripping water and the faraway groan of the house settling into its new skin. Then the shadows turned to her and bowed. The well exhaled a cold mist that curled around her ankles like a crown being laid at her feet. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply turned her back to it and walked toward the house. Behind her, the last remaining servants fled into the night. None of them looked back. Inside the mansion, the portraits on the walls had all changed. No longer did they depict the colonel's family. The faces were blackened, featureless, like smoke given form. A new portrait hung at the top of the staircase. A woman in black, her eyes pale and distant, barefoot in a field of bones. Ilara. She took her place at the foot of it. The house sighed in satisfaction, a sound like the last breath of something old finally fed. The reckoning was complete. The plantation stood alone in the mist, a blackened silhouette against a colorless dawn. What had once been the colonel's empire, rows of endless cane fields, proud brick walls, and the ringing of iron chains, now lay in ruin. The house had stopped breathing. The ground had stopped whispering, and yet it lived. A pale fog curled around the decaying veranda like a shroud. The windows, cracked and dark, reflected nothing, no sun, no sky, no soul. Crows perched on the fence posts but never cawed. They only watched, as if the land itself had ordered silence. No one had come back. The overseers who survived fled toward distant towns, speaking in drunken whispers about the night the house turned. The last remaining servants disappeared down dirt roads before sunrise, their footsteps quick, their eyes refusing to look back. By the third day, the plantation was stripped of human sound, and by the seventh, even the animals had left. But she remained, Ilara. She moved through the house like smoke through empty rooms. She no longer touched the floors, they simply adjusted to her, like the house itself bent around her presence. Her black dress floated around her like ash. Her hair hung loose, damp with the dew of the well. Her eyes were not human anymore, not entirely. They were a shade too pale, too still. The house knew her now. The walls that once wept with the pain of the enslaved now pulsed gently with her breath. She didn't command it. She was it. Each room carried an echo of what happened. The staircase still smelled faintly of gunpowder and blood. The dining hall was frozen mid-moment. Chairs overturned, plates shattered, chandeliers hanging by their chains like broken ribs. The ballroom, where she had once been rejected again and again by men who would rather spit on the floor than hold her hand, was cold and hollow. But there was no sadness here anymore, only ownership. The kind carved into bone, not written in ledgers. Outside, the well lay open. Its mouth breathed a slow, steady mist. If someone had been brave enough to walk close, they might have heard faint whispers, not screams anymore, just quiet murmurs, as if the dead were conversing among themselves, content. The land had what it was owed. It was at peace, in its own brutal way. On the 10th night after the reckoning, a traveler arrived, a peddler on horseback, lost in the fog. He saw the faint light flickering in the upper window and mistook it for shelter. His boots crunched over dead leaves as he approached the porch, his lantern swaying. He noticed how the air changed as he neared, colder, heavier, pressing against his chest like a hand. He climbed the steps slowly. The front door stood wide open, its hinges creaking softly though no wind touched it. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. Silence answered. The moment he stepped inside, his lantern flickered and died. The darkness swallowed him whole. And then faintly, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the sound of footsteps, soft, bare, measured. He froze. His breath clouded in front of him. Is someone there? A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. A woman in a long black dress. Her face was pale, eyes hollow and distant, but locked onto him like a predator deciding whether to strike. She did not speak. She only tilted her head slowly, unnaturally. The walls behind her seemed to lean closer. He stumbled backward. I didn't mean to intrude. But the house had already decided. The door slammed behind him. The footsteps drew nearer. He tried to run, but the hallway stretched, bending and twisting like a living thing. The light from the windows flickered between moonlight and total blackness. A whisper brushed his ear, not from her lips, but from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come." When they found his horse weeks later, it was standing at the edge of the woods, trembling, eyes wild. But the man was gone, and the house was silent once more. Years passed. The land never grew crops again. No new owners ever came. The plantation became a story, then a warning, then a whispered legend told around fires, about a house that remembered, about a daughter the world rejected and the well that claimed her. People said if you stood near it at night, you could hear her walking barefoot through the halls. Not screaming, not crying, just walking. The government eventually declared the property condemned. They boarded the windows, locked the gates, posted signs. But the boards always rotted faster there. The locks always rusted through. No matter what they did, the fog never lifted. Some claimed to have seen her figure in the window at dawn. Others said they heard chanting when the wind turned east. A few foolish ones tried to enter. None of them came back. The portrait still hangs at the top of the staircase. The frame warped, but the image untouched. Ilara in black, standing barefoot in a field of bones, her eyes like two pale moons. The house has a new name now, whispered through the towns. Not the Colonel's plantation, not the estate, just the silence, because that is what it gives you in the end. Not pain, not fire, not screams, just silence, the kind that belongs to the dead.